Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out devx.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development. I'm Raj Kumar, the President and Editor-in-Chief here at DevX. Great to be with all our regular listeners and people tuning in for the first time to this show where we talk about all the big headlines in global development. I am joined this week by my colleague, Fiona Zublin. Hey, Fiona.
Hello, nice to be here.
Nice to be with you as well. And Fiona is the Deputy Managing Editor here at DevX. And we're also joined by a special guest who's been with us before, George Ingram. Hi, George.
Morning, Raj. Nice to be with you.
Nice to be with you too. And I think our audience knows you really well. But of course, among many hats you wear, you are a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the Global Economy and Development Center there. Great to be with you both. Fiona, there's so many, as always, a lot of headlines to get into. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about a story that our colleague Michael Igo wrote related to a unionization effort, a labor fight happening at a pro-democracy group in the U.S. And then I'd love to get George's take on kind of the broader implications around localization and what it might mean for some of the organizations that work on development issues. Fiona, go ahead. If you've seen that piece, I'd love to hear you just kind of give us a background on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an organization called IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, which does a lot of work against, autocracy around the world. And now it is in this big labor fight. I think there's about 500 employees across 33 countries. And during COVID, of course, everyone was remote working. It sounds like that was sort of the germ of this. When after offices started to reopen, people who are working there, at least, according to the people that we interviewed, didn't necessarily feel like they were being listened to. They felt like they were being asked what they wanted or what was important to them in terms of work, but not necessarily like those desires were being acted on. And that sort of started this fight, which both sides kind of have said some difficult things about each other. But at its heart, it seems to also be about the localization issue and the fact that, these staff who are running the organization kind of feel like they're being ignored or not seen as important in the organization, as it makes a push for more, local leadership, and that their contributions aren't seen as something that they should necessarily be. Well, that they're not really being seen as having a lot of pull with the organization, which I guess causes a push for unionization, as it often does in different industries. But I am really curious about what George might have to say about this, because it does seem very tied up with localization to me.
Yeah, George, just real quick before we hear from you, there's one paragraph that I thought I would kind of intro you with, which, they say, but this industry-wide embrace of localization has sparked a, quote, race to the bottom. And this is from the same IFES employee that we interviewed in this piece. And it says, staff who keep the organization running find themselves undervalued and overworked, while higher paid, quote unquote, thought leaders who can help the organization stand out in funding proposals reap the benefits, the employee said. And it made me think, beyond this case of IFES specifically, but just more broadly in this sector, whether there is some kind of a trade-off when it comes to localization, whether there could be this race to the bottom, or maybe employees in the global north are sort of being sacrificed as we move to more hiring in the global south. How are you seeing this play out, George?
Well, it's interesting. Brookings, where I work, has been going through a unionization process, which is, as far as I can tell, has been a very smooth, cordial, successful effort. So I haven't heard of this sort of union versus management fight before. But it's interesting that people are equating this to localization, because on one hand, it has nothing to do with localization, because IFES staff in X country in the developing world, that staff is not part of what AID and a lot of the community consider to be local because they're part of IFAS. On the other hand, I kind of like bringing this into the localization agenda because it broadens the concept of localization beyond just locally owned and managed organizations to the operations of all countries, of all companies and NGOs in developing countries. And because I've thought that the localization agenda has been too narrow. And this broadens it. And I think it highlights the extent to which the development community pays higher salaries in developed countries than in developing countries. And I don't see this as a race to the bottom. I see it just the opposite. I see it as a dynamic that is going to raise the value and the appreciation of the work that is done by indigenous folks in development.
Yeah, I think it certainly has highlighted, like, however you define localization. And you're right, there's a particular sort of technical definition that many of us sort of inside the Beltway are using because we're thinking about USAID's funding and their push to allocate a greater percentage of that funding to quote unquote local organizations. But there is this broader concept of localization, which includes, who's running these international not-for-profit institutions. What do their boards look like? What percentage of their senior staff are based in the global South? What does compensation look like, et cetera? And I think that broader debate, you're right, is probably just as relevant, maybe more relevant than just the narrow definition that we're often, describing when we think about localization.
One reason I'm very interested in this aspect of it is because I've felt that what's been missing from the conversations around localization is what is the role of international expertise and entities in a localization context. The conversation has been too narrow. It's been just on local organizations, not on how they relate to the global community, and it needs to have that broader agenda.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, we could end up dreading having this very technical debate a decade from now if we set up a whole new set of rules that sort of define what localization is. And then 10 years from now, we say, well, look, we succeeded. We checked all the boxes, but it's not really driving development in the way we had hoped. And, we had an opinion piece recently in DevX as well that made this case that, look, it shouldn't be just about the way we see it. We got to listen to local people and what does local really mean? So maybe a person who is based in the global South wants to study abroad in Europe and get a master's degree, and then they want to go work in the US. And then, they go back home. Like, what counts as local? And are we defining it in a way that's in some ways sort of romanticizing the global South and, neglecting to understand the nuances in countries? And maybe we say, oh, look, this is a local organization, quote unquote, but it's really run by elites. And it's not really representing the kind of communities we're trying to get to and that we think need a voice in order to drive development in their country.
And what you see, and what I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, is people are understanding that for a decade we've had this conversation about localization in the U.S. among Americans or among Westerners. In the last 2 or 3 years, you've seen increasingly bringing in local voices to that, developing country voices, and it's changed the conversation.
Yeah, I think it has. Maybe, Fiona, you could tell us about another story if you saw it, which is written by Elisa Miolene, who's writing for our pro audience at DevX. And she wrote a piece about kind of the surprising fact that the U.S. House of Representatives actually passed something in this moment related to localization. Did you happen to see that piece?
Yeah, I feel like it's almost a joke. And I think we kind of play that up a bit in talking about how little Congress seems to get done sometimes, or how difficult it is to get anything done. But they did manage, I guess it would be a week ago now, to pass the Locally Led Development and Humanitarian Response Act with bipartisan support, or at least pass it through the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It still has to clear the Senate. So, let's not count our chickens before they hatch. But it does indicate that there's an appetite on both sides of the political spectrum, which cannot seem to agree on anything, especially now. So that's quite an interesting thing for them to agree on, that we need to think about different ways of delivering aid and delivering humanitarian assistance. And the bill is about localization. So it's interesting to see that making it through.
Yeah, absolutely, George. How big of a deal is this bill from your standpoint?
It's either, you can either see it as not a big deal at all, because what it basically does is embed in the law what the Biden administration's policies are on localization, or you can see it as a big deal because that gives the congressional stamp of approval on a bipartisan basis over those policies, which basically build on the efforts of the last three administrations, starting with George Bush and the MCC. And it's a very well crafted piece of legislation. It's very thoughtful, and it's very good legislation, and it avoids all of the micromanagement and excess reporting requirements and earmarks and all that stuff that Congress is unfortunately so well known for.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess it makes me remember back when Rod Shaw was USAID administrator, and he had one of the earlier pushes for localization, how some of the implementing partners, the for-profit implementing partners, got together and went directly to Congress and said, "Hey, we don't really approve of the way this is being done." And I think it was Darrell Issa at the time ended up writing a letter and essentially, really slowing down or even stopping that push for localization. And so, if we really do have broad bipartisan support for this effort, it is a pretty big deal, right? It is a big shift, given what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, it's a major accomplishment. But, Raj, what we've seen over the last 6 or 8 years, where you've had a lack of bipartisanship in the Congress, that's applied to politically sensitive issues. And the Congress over the last 3 or 4 Congresses has passed a half dozen or so what I would call secondary but important pieces of foreign aid legislation.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a quote in the piece. I want to just get your reaction to it, George. Walter Kerr, who leads Unlock Aid, which is a more recent lobbying group in the aid reform effort, but it seems to have really taken on a lot of prominence in this debate and has been pushing for this kind of legislation. So they're supporting it. But he's quoted in the piece saying, quote, there is a growing bipartisan sense that our current model of fly in, fly out contractors is not working. Do you think that that's, in a sense, what we're doing at USAID? Is it fly in, fly out contractors? Is that a fair depiction? And do you
No,
think that, okay, and do you think that's going to change? I mean, give me your take on that view that he brought up in the story.
that is a overstatement of the nature of the development industry today, and particularly with COVID, where a lot of development implementers came to understand that they can't get their Americans on the ground. They've got to depend on local staff, and what they found out is the local staff is pretty damn good, and they need to give them even more authority than they've had in the past. So I don't think you have this what you had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, fly in, fly out. It's an industry that is gradually, with difficulty, moving into a localization dynamic, and it's gonna take some time to carry that through, but it's headed in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think obviously the big question mark here for me anyway is if we end up with a Trump administration, there's going to be so many threats to foreign assistance in general. How will this localization push survive in that potential new era for U.S. foreign assistance? And I guess it doesn't hurt to have this codified into law, even though this might just be generally working around the edges and doesn't address some of the fundamental and core things that USAID does every day. But it certainly wouldn't hurt to have this in place if we do end up with a major shift in perspective in the White House.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think if there was a Trump administration, I would find the right messenger to explain that the development industry is doing what American business figured out was the right approach 30 years ago, and that is moving decision making as far down the line as possible, as close to the client as possible, because that's where you know what the real needs are in the marketplace.
Hi, I'm Kate Warren, Executive Editor at DevEx. If you are listening to this podcast, you are likely working to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But are you subscribed to DevEx Newswire? Global development can be a fast-moving, complex sector. Our team of global reporters work every day to bring you the news you need to make sense of it all. In DevEx Newswire, we keep you up to date on issues ranging from climate change financing to gender equality and global health to transforming the food system, all in a fun-to-read, free newsletter delivered directly to you 5 days a week. Join the hundreds of thousands of global development professionals who receive DevEx Newswire and visit devex.com/newsletters to sign up to this free newsletter today.
Thinking about, how government changes can affect, political changes can affect the way government organizes its foreign assistance apparatus. We had a story, Fiona, this week from our colleague Rob Merrick, our correspondent in the UK, about the latest on the FCDO saga. To tell us a little bit about
Oh,
that
yeah,
piece, if you would.
absolutely. So most people listening to this probably know that in 2020, the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office got formed because the FCO and the Department for International Development, the Foreign Office, and what's known as DFID merged. And there's a report out this week by the National Audit Office, which is a public spending watchdog in the UK, which found that it's been years since the merger, and FCDO is still what they class as a severe risk. It's at a severe risk of not really being able to deliver its work because it hasn't managed to hold on to expertise. They found that employees of the organization are still unhappy. Things like pay and career paths have never been resolved following the merger. And also that senior roles and expertise were really reduced. And so was the organization's credibility accordingly. So we've actually reported on this before. This report is new, but 2 years ago, DevEx reporters found that I think it was in the 14 months after the merger, almost 100 DFID advisors left the organization and were never replaced. So there's this real worry about not having this expertise and this institutional knowledge, which some could say, is going to open up other avenues, maybe new ideas, but also is potentially really destabilizing in a time that UK aid is already so destabilized. And actually, also this week, a separate report from a different watchdog, which also keeps an eye on UK aid, found that there's a really suspiciously low detection rate of fraud in FCDO spending, which means almost certainly they said that either fraud is happening and it's just not getting detected, or controls on aid spending are so tight that it's probably compromising the delivery of those funds to people who need them.
Yeah, I'm used to British understatement, so when I see a report that says severe risk, it's definitely eye-opening.
Well, we could have known that FCO and DFID were having trouble with the merger because we found out a couple of weeks ago from our correspondent Rob Merrick that they still have separate company football teams. Soccer teams. Apparently the merger would have created too big of a squad, so they still play as FCO and DFID. And Rob's journalist soccer team played them a couple weeks ago. I believe Rob's team lost, but don't quote me on that.
Well, that tells you everything you need to know, I guess, about the merger. And it does show, how I think a few different tensions, in the U.S. context. Of course, there was a long push back in the 90s to merge USAID into the State Department. Brian Atwood, who was USAID administrator at the time, really fought that successfully ultimately. I don't hear as much about that debate anymore. Who knows, if that will change over time. There's certainly a lot of push by some of the most right-leaning members of Congress to think about shrinking USAID and cutting foreign assistance budget. So on the one hand, you have that question about the relevance of aid and where it sits in the priorities of the foreign affairs apparatus. And then you got the question of localization. And, if you shrink the number of staff, how can you do more small contracts and grants? And so in the end, if you have a smaller staff, you end up having to do these larger contracts and grants to larger global North organizations. I think it's one of the tensions anyway that comes out to me when I read this report of a severe risk. What do you think, George?
Well, there was a minor effort at the beginning of the Trump administration to try to merge aid into state, but it never went anywhere. It's an issue that's never going to go away. It's always going to raise its head. And to me, the lesson of DFID and the merger is that 10, 20 years ago, DFID was looked to by us in Washington as the most innovative, cutting edge, intelligent, smart development agency. And that is no longer the case. 10, 20 years ago, we were envious of DFID. We looked to its leadership, and we miss that leadership today. It's lost that cutting edge that it had before the merger.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes down to having that technical expertise inside the agency, right? And I think that was where a lot of the leadership was. DFID was seen as really being at the cutting edge of understanding the latest in development thinking and finding, where the evidence is for what's working and really being innovative and creative. And that's hard to do if you're understaffed and your top experts have left.
Well, not just it's the expertise, but it's also having leadership that has the freedom and the ability to really assert the development cause and the development policies.
Well, and one thing that's very present in UK aid at the moment, as everyone is sort of looking toward the election, is, will DFID as a separate department be brought back? But also, can you bring back that innovation and that magic of DFID just by bringing back the department, or will it be something else? Obviously, this is a completely different aid environment than there was 4 years ago. So even as there's internal fights in, say, the Labour Party over whether they need DFID again, it's not obvious that they'll be able to recreate what UK aid once had.
Well, with the right political leadership, they could recreate it, but it would take a decade.
Right. These changes in government don't happen that fast. I think, it's an interesting question, Fiona, and I know that Rob Merrick has covered this before, and Labor, it seems like, is unlikely to make this a priority. Like, they're unlikely to break up the merger, and it's very likely FCDO will remain. Now, that doesn't mean that the same policies will pertain, and they might be able to regain some leadership even with this structure, but it does seem like that's not going to be an early move that a new Labor government makes. One potential question that's out there is, will the Labor government, if there is one, depending on when the election is held, will they be in a position to effectively appoint, or at least suggest the next head of OCHA, which is another story that came down this week as Martin Griffiths, who is the current head of OCHA, announced that he is retiring or resigning, stepping down based on a health situation that he's been facing. Fiona, can you just tell us a little bit more about that story? And then I'd love to hear what some of the consequences might be.
Yeah, of course. So Martin Griffiths, he's been the Chief Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN since 2021, I think July 2021 he started. And he says he is stepping down due to long COVID. It's not clear, exactly what the parameters of the health situation are, but he's just said that it limited his ability to be effective in the position, and he can't be sure when or if he's going to get his full strength back. So he is going to be stepping down. And I spoke to Colin Lynch, who is our reporter who reported the story, about any possible replacements that he's heard names bandied about. And he said he hasn't really heard any specific names, but that the more general question that needs to be addressed first is, will the role be filled by another British person? Because, of course, it traditionally is filled by a Brit. But then there are people who think it's time to retire that kind of tradition. Griffiths himself is British, but he also in 2022 said, I believe in an interview with the New Humanitarian, he said that it's too important a position to be decided by that type of favoritism. So it's not even clear that he himself supports that tradition. So potentially we could see that go by the wayside.
Well, and if I remember, he was appointed back when Boris Johnson was British Prime Minister, and the way that this tradition works, and it has varied, depending on UN agency, but it has typically worked that the country that has the preference to pick someone for that role suggests a kind of a short list to the UN Secretary General, and the UN Secretary General therefore has some kind of voice in the process, or at least apparent voice in the process, to help pick who that leader might be. And I believe what happened when Martin Griffiths was selected was actually he was not on the UK government's shortlist, that Boris Johnson had suggested some other candidates, and I think one candidate in particular that was not seen as qualified. And ultimately, as Guterres basically went right into the UN system and plucked Martin Griffiths from his role leading peace efforts in Yemen and put him into this job. So he fit the requirement of being a Brit, but he wasn't actually selected by the UK government. And so that was a bit of a middle ground. And who knows what we'll see this time, but it will depend in part, I guess, on what government there is in the UK. Martin Griffiths says he's going to step down, I think, by the end of June. So it will depend how quickly they move to fill that role. Will it be a Conservative government or a Labour government that sends a short list? And how will Guterres respond this time? And George, obviously, this raises all these questions about, should these positions be, picked or even influenced by nationality? Is there a road to a new system? I mean, we talk about this a lot, and it just seems like, as much as we've been discussing this for maybe a decade or two here at DevEx, the fact is that with few exceptions, these traditional national preferences remain.
Yeah, it's an organization like the UN has to have a balance in nationalities that staff it up, particularly at the senior level. But there should not be a country lock on a particular position. That's not how you get the best people serving the public causes. But how you get away from that, I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, it's really challenging in the way that so many UN agencies rely on voluntary contributions from donor countries, and the UN itself obviously relies on funding from donor countries, and so it becomes this bargaining chip, and the tradition of one country having a position and then losing it, could potentially throw in question other countries' traditional roles, everywhere from the World Bank to the IMF, right? So it just starts to, that whole house of cards maybe should crumble, but no one wants to be the one to start crumbling it. Well, let's maybe move on to some other stories from the week. Fiona, there's been several, but one piece that comes to mind is our coverage of the Gaza pier, the floating pier that was put forward as a potential solution, or at least partial solution, to the humanitarian crisis there by the U.S. government. We had a piece about that. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea is to build a floating pier off the shores of Gaza to help deliver aid into the territory. But a lot of NGOs are really skeptical of this because they are pointing out rightly that there is not a shortage of aid. The problem is getting it in, and that it's being blocked at land borders. So potentially there are diplomatic solutions to get the aid in via existing routes rather than building a whole new system. So yeah, I mean, aid groups are pretty united that we had 3 reporters on this story, and people that they spoke to said that really the issue is just about persuading Israel to let aid in and not about creating a floating workaround.
Yeah, George, I don't know if you saw this piece, or I'm sure you're aware of this situation. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I've been following it, and I saw the piece. And I don't understand the criticism of this floating bridge. I mean, right now, we should be in favor of anything that will get humanitarian assistance into Gaza. And this is one option. And not only does it potentially help get the humanitarian aid in there, but it just highlights how inhumane it is to be stopping the natural flow of trucks across the border. So,
yeah, I think you're exactly right. As a diplomatic exercise, right? I mean, even the piece talks about whether this is a performative last resort, quote unquote. And I guess I can see the one side that we had a representative from Mercy Corps quoted in the piece who talks about, look, the same conditions that pertain to the land crossing of aid is gonna pertain to this sea crossing, and so what's the difference? I think that's a valid argument. But on the other hand, what you're saying makes sense too, which is maybe this is performative, but creating that performance is yet another opportunity to highlight the need to get aid in and to change the rules around getting it in, which maybe puts some more pressure that perhaps will loosen the conditions on getting humanitarian aid in, either through this sea crossing or through the existing land crossings. Who knows if it's going to work, but it does seem like if you're in the Biden administration's, camp, you're looking for something you can do. This is something.
I'm not a big fan of performative art, but sometimes it has its place and role. And that sometimes performative actions has a role in the diplomatic political community. And I think this is one case in which it does for sure.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting story. I recommend it to the people listening in just to hear, because we hear this obviously from the defense and diplomatic community a lot, but to hear it directly from humanitarians, their take on what this peer really means and how it would work, I thought was pretty eye-opening and interesting. Fiona, just as we look here to wrap up, were there any other stories from the week that you wanted to mention to our listeners?
Oh gosh. Well, I just to go back to the story that we just talked about. I think it's one of the things that's really interesting about this pier is that it's not the only project like this that's been proposed. I mean, Cyprus has been talking about doing a completely separate sea route of aid into Gaza since like November of last year, I think. So it's clearly something that is on the collective mind, because it's the subject of two separate projects. But yeah, I think the last big story of the week that I feel like we haven't really talked about is Saudi Arabia being tapped to chair the UN Commission on the Status of Women for the next 2 years, which in some ways like is also a story about like performance is probably the wrong word, but about ceremony being really important, because this is largely a ceremonial role according to many of our sources. But ceremony can be important in this way, and Saudi Arabia's record on gender equality has really rubbed people the wrong way when it comes to them leading this commission. So I'm curious what you guys think about that.
Yeah, it's fascinating because sometimes in this community that we talk to here at DevX, there's general unanimity around what gender equality should look like and what it should mean, and then you see something like the Commission on the Status of Women, and it's a little bit shocking to realize that no, actually, a lot of these things that we all assume are obvious are highly debatable in these fora. And so I think we had a quote in the story on this from Oxfam, from Amina Hershey, saying, quote, "Not a lot of ground was lost, but not a lot of progress," right? So, and in a sense, suggesting that maybe that stalemate is itself a kind of progress in this moment when there's a lot of rollback on the rights of women and girls around the world. So it's an interesting piece because it does open your eyes a bit if this is the world that you live and work in, and you don't realize maybe how much some of these fundamental rights are in question and even being pushed back in lots of parts of the world.
Raj, one comment on that is the one piece that you all ran recently that not just surprised me, but shocked me. But then I looked into it a little bit, and Saudi Arabia has actually made progress the last few years in women's rights. And maybe this putting Saudi Arabia in this role not only acknowledges that, but helps pull them on, puts them the floodlight on Saudi Arabia and makes them make even more progress. So there could be some benefit from this.
Yeah, I like that optimistic view of it. And the truth is, Saudi Arabia, in many ways, has become a really lightning rod debating point among people in our community because of exactly what you said, right? There are the examples of human rights abuses and really negative things that people are very concerned about. And then on the other hand, there are these examples of progress. And so there's a big debate about how to look at Saudi Arabia and their role. And we'll just have to follow their chair of this position and see what it might mean. Listen, it's been great talking to you, George and Fiona, and everyone who's been listening in. Thank you. If you're interested in all the stories we talked about and many more we didn't have time to get to, of course, subscribe to the DevX Newswire, where you can see everything we publish here at DevX. And stay tuned for this show again next week. This has been This Week in Global Development. Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, George.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a DevX Pro member by going to devx.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.